Please join me in welcoming Dr. Syed Nizamuddin Ahmed.
Thank you. Our topic today is an exceedingly difficult one, namely being and nothingness, between Orient and Occident, or between Occident and Orient. I don't remember how it was actually appeared on the poster. So, where do we begin? A very famous Western philosopher, a European philosopher, a German, named Martin Heidegger, famously observed in the opening words of his famous book, Being in Time, quoting Plato's Sophist, which begs the question as to what it means to say that something is, that something exists. So the quote from Plato's dialogue, The Sophist, is 244a. It reads as follows: "For manifestly you have long been aware of what you have of what you mean when you use the expression being, quote unquote, existence. We, however, who used to think we understood it, have now become perplexed." So this very question, which Heidegger called the Seinsfrage in German, the question of being or the question of existence, is our concern today. The study of being, the study of existence as such, being qua being, existence as existence, or existence in as much as it is existence, is an exceedingly old pursuit. It is that branch of metaphysics known as ontology. And some of the greatest minds in the history of philosophy have assiduously devoted their lives to the pondering of this question. Among them were the illustrious ancient sages of Hellas, known as the pre-Socratics. Socrates himself, of course, reflected and refracted through his spokesperson, Plato. And perhaps most importantly for the ancient Greek world and Western civilization, as well as Islamic philosophy, Islamic civilization, would be Aristotle. In ancient China, we have figures such as Lao Tzu, Zhuangzi. We have in ancient India figures such as Shankaracharya and Nagarjuna. Now, we can't really look at all of these thinkers. We'll take a few. And of course, my interest really is in Islamic philosophy. And I'm sort of using this as a sneaky way to get you interested in Islamic philosophy. And so the key figures in Islamic philosophy who dealt with this subject were people like Al-Farabi, who died in 950. I'll just stick to the Christian dates. Otherwise, that's 339 Hijri, but it won't mean much to most of the audience here. We also have, of course, Ibn Sina, who died in 1037. We have Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi, who died in 1240. We have Suhrawardi, that's a Suhrawardi al-Maqtul, who died 1191. And we have Mullah Sadra, who died around 1641. So, I want to really begin with Aristotle, fully aware that he's not the be-all and end-all in terms of world philosophy, but for our story, we do have to privilege Aristotle in as much as he had a profound influence in the Islamic world. So you have to understand this question: what does it mean to say that something exists? I don't know if any of you have ever thought about it before. It's not the kind of thing that you kind of typically examine. But that's really what Aristotle was concerned with. And he is considered to be the founder of a subject called metaphysics. Now, Aristotle, paradoxically, though, never used the word metaphysics. In his writing, he referred simply to wisdom in Greek, Sophia. He referred to first philosophy, and he referred to divine wisdom. Aristotle was concerned with founding a science which was devoted to the study of things, not in as much as they might be studied in physics or chemistry or biology, but things, and thing is the most general term you could use, but things studied merely from the point of view of that they exist. All right? So if you have a hunk of gold, for example, you can study its properties in physics and chemistry and other sciences, metallurgy and whatnot. But he was concerned with the very fact that, if I only had a brick of gold here, right? I could hold it up and we could perceive it and we would examine it. And we could understand that it's an actual gold brick that exists. Well, what does it mean to say that that exists? All right, something much more near at hand. We've got a lot of tables and chairs here, or desks and chairs. What does it mean to say that the table exists or that the chair exists? So Aristotle was interested in developing such a science. And for him, this was the ultimate question. And so metaphysics was concerned with ultimate causes, or what we would now in a more modern English speak of as ultimate explanations. Because Aristotle came up with what he called these four causes, or they're more like four modes of explanation. So he was after these ultimate explanations behind things. And of course he also wanted to found a science that was rigorous, that was demonstrative, that was based on principles of logic, such as the law of non-contradiction, and not mere dogma or opinion. So what ultimately happened with Aristotle was that he embarked, as it were, on a search for the most fundamental sort of being, what we might call primary being. So this led to him ultimately to found a science of existing things. So again, if you think of a chair or a table and you say, well, the table exists, the chair exists. What really distinguishes the chair from the table and the table from the chair or from any other objects? What distinguishes some distinct object A from another distinct object B? So if we just take an actual table and an actual chair in this room, our senses perceive it, we can see that it exists. We can see that the chair exists. But they are two distinct things. And so that which distinguishes these objects one from another is what is called in philosophy the quiddity, or in Arabic mahiyya. Quiddity is an English word that comes from the Latin quid est, which simply means what is it. It's the same in Arabic. Mahiyya or mahuwa is just to ask the question what something is. And so the quiddity is that which is said in answer to the question, what is X? And so the quiddity of a table is all of the qualities that make it a table, and the quiddity of the chair is all the qualities that make it the chair, and they allow us to distinguish between them. But take the chair, for instance. The chair, especially nowadays, I mean, it's rare that a carpenter would actually build you a chair. There's an engineer somewhere, he has some sort of a design, and then they design it and they come up with further designs and processes, and you make a factory and you go to IKEA and you bring home a box, and then you have to go through these instructions that have no words to figure out how to, if you've ever shopped at IKEA. So at some point that chair did not exist. And so we can distinguish between the quiddity of the chair and the existence of the chair. So it's that existence that Aristotle really wants to get to. So the chair exists, the table exists. If we look out in the universe, in the cosmos, there's birds, bees, flowers, trees, boats, cars, giraffes, kangaroos, there's all sorts of things. But Aristotle ultimately wanted to get to being qua being, being as such. However, he didn't succeed in my view, and that's one reason we opened with Heidegger, although I'm not here to talk about Heidegger. He also thought that Western philosophy took a wrong turn way back then and never really got to the heart of being, and he presented his own understanding of things, and we're not going to talk about today, but it was a worthwhile pursuit. In the Islamic world also, when Aristotle was translated into Arabic, Muslims took a similar approach to, what is this whole question of being? So why do I think that Aristotle didn't succeed? Well, Aristotle, if you read his book, The Metaphysics, And it's funny that it got this title because he never uses that word. And it's just like a series of various discourses that he's written. And the way that it got the name metaphysics is really due to more than likely librarians or editors. There's two versions of the story. Because Aristotle was an extremely prolific individual. The Muslims called him al-Muallim al-Awwal, the first teacher, the prince of those who know. And he authored a huge number of works on all sorts of topics, from biology to physics to logic. And so they didn't know what to do with these weird little writings he had about being and existence. And so either the editor, when they were editing like a collected form of his works, they put them after his writings on physics, metaphysics, that which comes after the treatises on physics. Other story is that when they were filing his books away in the Library of Alexandria, and mind you, in those days books weren't in this form. It wasn't in the form of a bound book, a codex. They were scrolls. So let's put these scrolls here, let's put these scrolls here, we'll put the physics scrolls here. What do we do with these? We'll put them after the physics. So it's almost like a card catalog number or something, and a word which he never used, but it was very apt in some ways, because when it's translated into Arabic, it becomes ma wara' al-tabi'a or ma ba'd al-tabi'a. And even in English, it's that which is beyond sort of, just mere physical sort of entities, and we're going to some sort of higher sort of philosophical understanding of things. So with Aristotle, what happened when he wrote the Metaphysics, and he talks about going after the ultimate causes of things and finding what is primary being, he ends up looking at different instances of existing things. And he comes up with a notion which sometimes in the English translations is translated as being or existence, and other times is translated as substance, and that's the Greek word ousia. And so he ended up saying that, well, the most fundamentally existing things were living things, which he called primary substance. And then he was interested in going after the highest genus of primary substance, which is God. And so metaphysics becomes this sort of demonstrative science which is interested in the ultimate explanations for things, and is also the divine science, or what he actually calls in Greek theology, the study of God. Because God then is seen as primary substance, the highest genus of substance. So oddly enough, God isn't really seen as pure being. This was something that comes later with the Muslim understanding of things. So by the time the Muslims end up reading these sorts of texts, and mind you, Aristotle is not easy to read, and the Metaphysics is probably one of his least readable works. So the great Muslim philosopher Ibn Sina claims in his autobiographical statement, which he dictated to his student Bahman Yar, that he read the Arabic version of the Metaphysics. It's not clear exactly which one it was. There was maybe one or two different translations, and in Arabic some of the books didn't get translated, but these are fine details. He claims he read it 40 times, and he despaired of being able to understand the book, and then one day he was out in the marketplace, and he found some sort of a commentary or explanation or summary of the whole book by Al-Farabi. And he bought that, and then the doors were opened for him. What book he exactly read is hard to say. The treatises and works of Al-Farabi do survive in various forms, and there is some sort of a commentary that survives on the Metaphysics, but it's very small. And was that the one he read? I don't know. But he read something by Al-Farabi, and then sort of the doors opened for him. And Ibn Sina, produced a number of important works in philosophy. And so when you talk about Islamic philosophy, he's really an inflection point. He's a turning point in the history of Islamic philosophy. So now if we approach the question as the Muslims did, they really exploited this distinction between quiddity and existence. Aristotle noticed this distinction, but he doesn't really take it the way the Muslims did, or go with it where the Muslims went with it. And so again, if we look at a proposition, a logical proposition, any logical proposition, you have a subject and a predicate. S is P. The table is brown. So you have a logical subject and a logical predicate, and you have this little word is. And in many languages you have an is, what's called the copula or the copulative verb, the to be verb. Other languages don't have it, but it's understood. So if you look at that proposition, the chair or the table is brown, what does it mean? Really, what is it asserting? Well, it's simply saying that you have some sort of quality. In this case, it's color, and it's predicating that color to the chair. But the Muslims analyze this in much more detail. So if you again think about the notion of quiddity and existence, again, let's go back to our table. If I just say the table exists, right? I can perceive a table in front of me. I recognize that it exists. And then through further mental reflection, I can conceive at the same time then of its quiddity and its existence. You know, I can imagine the scenario when it didn't exist. And then similarly, I can imagine something, some concept in my mind, and I can go and implement that concept. I could design something in my head. It could even be something very simple, just be like, I'm going to make myself a cup of coffee. And you get up and you make the coffee. And before, the cup of coffee didn't exist, right? So you can conceive of existence and quiddity. But that is something which happens only on the level of the mind. If we take one of these tables here, like this table, and say, aha, here's this table, well, where is its quiddity and where is its existence? I can take this table and I can completely disassemble it into its legs and its different constituent parts, and when I'm done, I'll have a whole bunch of other existing entities, or mawjudat in Arabic, but I won't, and each one will have its own quiddity. Quiddity of the leg, the quiddity of the tabletop, the quiddity of the veneer, all of that. But I won't have come to its existence. There's no way, I mean, even if you take like a piece of fruit, like an apple, there's no way you can like slice it with the world's sharpest samurai sword, so you can just or lightsaber or whatever, if you're a Jedi Knight. I have the quiddity here, and I have the existence here, and I'll put them in two separate boxes. You cannot do this. That only happens on the level of mental analysis. This is the realm of mafahim, or concepts or notions in Islamic philosophy. So similarly, we have the notion of the table. So I see this table, and then you can remove this table, you can destroy it completely, but I'll still have a mental notion of the table which I saw when I went to FIU on such and such day. Right? So you can have a concept of a thing, and the concept has an external referent. So in the level of mafahim, or the level of concepts, that's one level, and then the table in the external world, in concreto, so to speak, is a separate thing. That's called haqiqa in Arabic. So there's, excuse me. And so we can talk about we can talk about existence in the same way. We can speak of wujud, or existence, in Arabic it would be wujud, in the same way. We can speak of the existence as a concept and existence as an actual reality. So the debate ultimately ended up in the Islamic world was as follows. Is existence a merely notional thing, or does it have a true referent in the external world? So if you analyze things on a logical level only, in terms of existence as a logical predicate, the table exists, the dog exists, then we would say that existence is purely notional. It is a notion, it is a concept which occurs to, let's say, table when we say the table exists. However, what about the actual situation, existence itself? And this is where things get very interesting in Islamic philosophy. So it's claimed that Ibn Sina upheld the idea that existence was merely notional, or merely a thing in the mind. So again, when you analyze some logical proposition and you say X exists, then you say that X is some logical subject and existence is a predicate which occurs, and an occurrence takes place in the mind. So they say that that's a purely mental notion because you can't separately point to existence in the external world. You can only point to existing things. So it seems like these guys agree with Aristotle. But in fact, some people will claim, and I think this is probably the more solid view, that Ibn Sina was only talking on the level of mafahim, or on the level of notion, and he wasn't talking about the level of reality. And he didn't really get into that. So other philosophers also in Islamic history upheld quite literally this idea that being or existence was a merely notional thing which occurs to existing things. And that's the figure which I mentioned earlier, a guy named Suhrawardi. So it's not until much later, until in fact Mullah Sadra, who's really, we would have to consider his work to be the high watermark of metaphysical thinking in Islam, who comes up with a completely different and sort of radical thesis. But here he is putting very much in philosophical terms the insight of a Sufi thinker. Oftentimes Sufis are referred to as mystics. I have some reservations about this term, but I don't want to get into that, so I'll just, for the purposes of this discussion, say that he was a Sufi mystic. So the Sufis have this idea of a practicing of a rigorous asceticism or ascesis in the form of additional prayers and meditations and visualizations and so forth, and the incessant repetition of the name of God, whereby they ultimately come to some profound insight into the very nature of things, a kind of pristine cognition of the instantaneous disposition of the real with a capital R at every instant. And Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi was the figure who preceded Mullah Sadra, and he didn't write as a philosopher or write in a philosophical way. That is to say, he didn't write in a very sort of systematic, he didn't present his ideas in a systematic fashion. In fact, he wrote under a sort of outpouring of the kind of effusion of truths which was coursing through him, as it were. And his Arabic is very eloquent also, but also very difficult, but at the same time it has a profound sort of attraction if you are well versed in the Arabic language. And so Mullah Sadra also was involved in these kind of, shall we say, this profound ascesis, or if you prefer mystical exercises, as well as pursuing the more didactic approach of philosophy. And he then completely breaks with this, all these ideas that came before, and says in the external world it is truly only being which is real. It is only existence which truly is the real. And this thesis was called Asalatul Wujud, or the fundamental reality of existence in the external world, as opposed to the fundamental reality of quiddity in the external world. So he says that when we say that the table exists, or if I say this is a table, or if I have, a far more elegant example, if I had a rose, and if I were holding a rose, and a rose is very nice, in Islamic, especially Persian culture and Persian poetry and all this, but if I had like a magnificent rose and I was holding it here, then I would say this is a rose. And so we'd say, well, you say you have rose, or this is a rose, as simply rose exists, the rose exists. Exists is a predicate which is occurring to the rose. Mullah Sadr says, no, this is completely wrong. It's not quiddity of rose that happens to exist. It's completely the other way around. It's pure existence, pure or sheer being, existentiating itself as a rose at that point. And so quiddities are actually modifications of being. And the ultimate being is God. God is pure being or sheer existence. So this was the insight of Mullah Sadra, and he put forth a number of sort of rational proofs for this and argued for his ideas very extensively. He had many contributions in other areas, and as people in that age often did, great figures of his level, they wrote profusely. And He wrote a number of works, and his most detailed presentation of all of this is in a book called The Book of the Four Journeys, which is in 9 volumes. It runs to around 4,500 pages. It really needs to be translated into English. And he has shorter presentations of that as well. So just the doctrine of the fundamental reality of existence in the external world, he also has a summary of that in about 100 pages. And there the writing is much more polished. In the Asfar, or the Book of the Four Journeys, it's clear that he did not get to go back over and edit the book and produce like a final polished version. And this is the days of the manuscript, the handwritten book. They didn't have copy editors. There wasn't some guy sitting in the equivalent of someone at Oxford University Press, an army of people who are going to go over it afterwards, 10 times. And so some of the portions of the Asfar are a bit unpolished in that regard, but then that's supplemented by his shorter works on all sorts of other topics. So this is a really important kind of development in the history of Islam. And there was a very accomplished scholar of Islamic philosophy who died in the 20th century, late 20th century. I think in the late 90s he died. And his name was Toshihiko Izutsu. He was Japanese. He was a very profound scholar of Islamic studies. Now, he very much was impressed with the thought of Mullah Sadra, figures like Mullah Sadra and Ibn al-Arabi and others. And Ibn al-Arabi, in his formulation of this doctrine, he spoke of the oneness of being. Mullah Sadr, of course, is talking about asalatul wujud, or the fundamental reality of existence or being in the external world. Muhyiddin al-Arabi spoke of wahdatul wujud, although he didn't exactly use this phrase. His followers who come after him employed this phrase very much, the oneness or the unicity of being. So Izutsu was very impressed with this idea, and Izutsu was an extremely accomplished man. He started out studying linguistics, and by the time he was about 26, he was teaching Russian literature in Japan. He knew 34 languages. That's not a joke. I mean, that's not even an exaggeration. I have been to Japan several times, and I've asked people there. So like, the go-to grammar for Sanskrit in Japanese is by Izutsu. The go-to textbook to learn Urdu, yes, Urdu, is by Izutsu. The translation of the Quran into Japanese in 3 volumes, the first genuine one, there was an earlier one which wasn't, I think it was probably done through another language, is by Izutsu as well. So, when we say he knew all these languages, he really knew them. And he wrote some profound studies comparing the thought of Ibn al-Arabi with that of the Chinese thinker Lao Tzu of the Tao Te Ching. And he wrote studies on Zen Buddhism and all of this. But so my point is that he thought, he took the thought of Ibn al-Arabi, this idea of oneness of being, and he said that there are a lot of commonalities in Eastern philosophy. And the Muslims really figured this out really well. And this thing which they call oneness of being is a fantastic sort of language or template to understand other religious traditions, mystical traditions if you like. And so he called this, his use of wahdatul wujud, or oneness of being, as a meta-philosophy of Oriental philosophies. And he has an essay on this, fortunately in English, and he has a more substantial work in Japanese. So I remember when I first came across his ideas, I was very impressed. And if you want, you can go and read his book, Sufism and Taoism. It's a fascinating read. And it works very well. And he has another essay in which he makes similar remarks about an Indic system of thought called Vedanta in India, which is very, very similar. It talks about, the supreme is Brahman, and Brahman is actualized into Nirguna Brahma and Saguna Brahma. In other words, Brahman, or the ultimate being, who is being, consciousness, bliss, Satya Chitananda, and how this Brahman is Brahman with names or with attributes and without attributes. And it's very similar sort of ideas in Islam as well, where you talk about the divine essence before the manifestation of the names, and God as manifested through his divine names, which is a very big idea in Ibn al-Arabi. So I was very impressed with these ideas, but then I always thought, well, what about Buddhism? And I'm going to just conclude with a few thoughts on Buddhism as a kind of way to end this and just open it up for discussion. Because my understanding of Buddhism was that, Buddhism is an atheistic religion. There really isn't a concept of God, certainly not a concept of a personal God, the kind that you find especially in Christianity, and especially in its evangelical forms, but Christianity in general. And in Islam you find some notions of that as well, but there's quite a spectrum in Islam as well. So I always wondered about this because, the fundamental realization of the Buddha is that usually they translated that, life, that human existence is characterized or marked by suffering. Although I don't think that's a good translation of dukh, dukkha in Pali. But they usually translate that as suffering. I really think a better rendering would be, it really is referring to sort of like mental agitation. And this kind of mental agitation that arises due to the samsaric consciousness or the dispersion of human beings in phenomena, in phenomenal dispersion in all its variegated in all of its variety. And that, the only way to get out of this is to realize that ultimately all phenomena are empty. And the term used in Sanskrit is shunyata. And so, just as being or existence, wujud in Arabic, becomes the obsession of Islamic philosophers. And mind you, I should tell you that Mullah Sadra's school of thought survives to this day. It's not some sort of academic thing somewhere. It survives to this day, especially in the Shia world, in Shia seminaries. And not for all Shia seminarians, but for many, Mullah Sadra is something like, and these are analogies, so they don't go 100%, but he's something like a St. Thomas Aquinas figure for traditional Catholics. And a lot of his formulations are considered to be definitive the same way that for the Catholic Church, Thomas or Thomistic theses are definitive. So just as being was a kind of obsession for Muslim philosophers, Islamic philosophers, shunyata or emptiness becomes this all-consuming topic which is discussed in Buddhist thought. So how do you reconcile that? If you actually look into it, and Izutsu makes this argument in a number of his writings, that what is really at stake here is not nothingness. It isn't nihilism. Shunyata is an emptiness. Well, emptiness of what? And in the formulation, as Izutsu likes to do, he puts things into the wahdatul wujud perspective as a meta-philosophy of Oriental philosophies. The way that doctrine was developed in the Islamic world, in the school of Ibn al-Arabi and then taken up by thinkers like Mullah Sadr as well, was that God is pure being. God is pure being, and God also has a kind of existence before existence, in the sense that the divine essence is utterly beyond names and attributes. Names and attributes are manifested later, so to speak, and later we don't really use in a temporal sense. It's not a tense. The divine essence is logically prior. And so, in the metaphysical language of the school of Ibn al-Arabi, you have wujud, or being, which is utterly non-conditioned being, which in Arabic is called al-wujud la bishart. Utterly non-conditioned being, so much so that it is even beyond the condition of being non-conditioned. And then you have negatively conditioned being, or al-wujud bisharti la, and then you have conditioned being, al-wujudu bisharti shay in Arabic. And so Izutsu says that when the Buddhists speak of shunyata, they are talking about this non-conditioned dimension. And I always thought that was a very interesting interpretation. He says some other things which I would just like to share with you by way of wrapping this up. In a work which he wrote entitled Toward a Philosophy of Zen Buddhism, he makes this observation. We may do well to recall at this point that Buddhism in general stands philosophically on the concept of, and here he uses a very fancy Sanskrit word, pratitya samutpad, in Japanese engi, i.e. the idea that everything comes into being and exists as what it is by virtue of the infinite number of relations it bears to other things, each one of these other things owing again its seemingly self-subsistent existence to other things. Buddhism, in this respect, is ontologically a system based upon the category of relatio or relation, in contrast to, say, the Platonic Aristotelian system, which is based on the category of substantia. That's a very deep remark. To explain it a little bit further, Aristotle, when he was putting forward his metaphysics and also in other works on logic which overlap, he divides everything into either substances or accidents. A substance is not like a controlled substance that you can go to prison for if you have too much of or something. No. Substance is that which stands alone, as it were, and an accident is that which inheres in the substance. So to put this in the most simple terms, remember our example, the table is brown. So brown is an accident. It's in fact a quality, it's a color which occurs to table, which is a substance. Brownness by itself we can't find anywhere. You can have a white shirt, but whiteness is nowhere to be found. It has to inhere, so to speak, in an actual shirt, and we say the shirt is white. So there's this idea of substance and accidents, and then there are 9 accidents. Among them is quantity, quality, and one of them is relation. So let's just focus on that because that's what Izutsu was referring to. So he says that the system of philosophy that developed in the West and also developed in the Islamic world is based on Aristotle's distinction between substance and accident. And Buddhist thought is really based on the accident of relation. Let me put that again in perspective for you using the example. So if we've got this table, all right, and we say the table exists, well, what is a table really? So the Buddhists will say, what do you really mean by a table? What is a table? Oh, I forgot about this, yes. What is a table? You know, there's all sorts of tables. There's round tables, there's rectangular tables, there's square tables. Some have 3 legs, some have 4 legs. And then, you know, the table, if it just consists of a tabletop and some legs, and then what about the tabletop, and then what about the legs? And they exist in relation to the tabletop. And they continue to analyze things like this in this way, so that ultimately they come up to the idea that, well, there's really nothing, there's just a bunch of relationships, and that's shunyata, that's emptiness. So Izutsu is saying that even here, there is a commonality, but he arrived at that, or he understood that, again, through this lens of the thought of Ibn al-Arabi as interpreted by Mullah Sadra. So his notion of wahdatul wujud, or oneness of being, and this scheme of pure being, utterly non-conditioned, then negatively conditioned, and then positively conditioned as an approach to the study comparatively. And he was very interested in comparative studies. It's, I think, a very interesting one, but it really wasn't taken up by people after him. But his writings are there. And unfortunately, I think that Izutsu isn't widely read. He deserves to be more known and better known. And so I would encourage you to look at his writings. So this is really all I really wanted to present on a very, very simple level. And I'm happy to, obviously, I mean, we could talk about this in much more detail and at a much higher level, but, you know, for an audience of this kind, undergraduates and so forth, this is, I think, sufficient up to this point, and I'm very happy to open it up for questions and answers, and thank you. So do I just, oh yeah, all right, go ahead, man in the black shirt.
So you mentioned at the very end, these 2 ideas of determining existence by relation, and then determining existence through like existence itself and then accident. Is there any way to reconcile those 2? Is there any way that they could both exist in tandem, or are they contradictory?
No, I don't think they're contradictory, and Izutsu is not really, in that passage, he's not really saying they're contradictory. He's just saying that they're different ways of, they're different points of departure, if you like. He does further on make the remark that if you are really committed to a substance-accident metaphysics, then that will lead to what the Muslims called asalatul mahiyya, or the fundamental reality of quiddity, which he doesn't agree with. So. Yeah. Yes. in the red hoodie, yes.
Can you go into a bit more detail about the difference between Ibn Sina's idea of being as opposed to Mulla Sadra? Right?
Yes, yes, yes.
I don't have to very deep background on this, but
Mm-hmm.
my understanding is that there were some other philosophers in that time, Jewish philosophers, who were very influenced by Ibn Sina, who seemed to have the same philosophy as Mulla Sadra. So I know he came later. So could you just distinguish?
Look, Ibn Sina had a lot of influence. A lot of people were influenced by him. I mean, you couldn't have been a Muslim philosophizing after Ibn Sina and not read Ibn Sina. Everybody read Ibn Sina. Mulla Sadra's Book of the Four Journeys, even though it's really huge, is patterned on another very large work, which was by Ibn Sina, called the Kitab al-Shifa. And basically, the book, which means the book of the healing or the cure. And it's a kind of oblique reference to a verse in the Quran that says that the Quran is a healing for the hearts. A lot of people confuse that. They think it's a book on medicine. And they're not, maybe shouldn't be blamed too much for that, because Ibn Sina was also an accomplished physician. And he has a really huge book on medicine, but that was known as the Canon of Medicine. I don't know, the Jewish philosopher you're thinking of is probably Maimonides. But there were others. There was Abu al-Barakat al-Baghdadi. And Abu al-Barakat's dates are messy. I wrote this down somewhere. Abu al-Barakat al-Baghdadi. So they say he died around 547, but he may have died in 537. That's Hijrah, so that would be 1142. He was a Jewish philosopher from Baghdad. He did become a Muslim. Whether he genuinely became one or for other reasons is debated to this day. But he was also heavily influenced by Ibn Sina. He wrote a book called the Kitab al-Mu'tabar. But in terms of being, Ibn Sina, Abu al-Barakat, I don't know about Maimonides, I don't work on him. They are in agreement. But what is different with Mulla Sadra is that Mulla Sadra really comes out and makes this distinction between the mere mental notion of being and the reality of being. That is something which isn't brought out in the works of Avicenna or Ibn Sina. And it's not clear when you read him, when he uses the word wujud in Arabic, or existence or being, whether he's talking about merely the notion or the reality, and you have to really read carefully. And so this question was not problematized really decisively in this way until the time of Mulla Sadra, centuries later. So if Ibn Sina died in 1037, and Mulla Sadr died in 1641. So that's a long time. It's about 6 centuries, and that question of being, whether we're talking about the notion or the reality, and whether it's quiddity that's truly real in the external world, or whether it's being that's truly real in the external world, that question wasn't posed and problematized in that way until Mulla Sadra's teacher, who we didn't mention. He was a guy named Mir Damad. He's the one who really first formulates it this way, although it's there as well in a more sort of less decisive way in the person named Suhrawardi, who I also mentioned to you, who died in 1191. So it's a very long story, the story of being, and it has many twists and turns. Yes?
So you mentioned that, for example, Mulla Sadra, and I think the ideas of Mulla Sadra very much relates to the ideas of Plato and Aristotle, that, for example, the substance precedes the accidents.
Mm-hmm.
If I got that correct. There's substance and then...
Yeah, accidents can't be by themselves. Yeah.
So
they don't stand alone, right?
I think one argument to make about this point is that, I think, as Sartre points out, we can think about this reversely. The thing that existence precedes being. For example, and the way I think about this, for example, we are sitting in this room, and then there may be a table as a being in the other room, but we are not there. So we cannot really say anything about the existence of that table in the room. So if all of us, all of a sudden, disappear from this room, then the existence of that table has no meaning to us because we cannot say anything about this. So in my mind, it seems a bit contradictory that if we say that, for example, a form of metaphysical being precedes the physical being of the table, or if we say that we are here, thus the table exists, you know, I think these two are opposing each other. Is there any way that maybe...
I don't think they're opposing each other. Sartre is an important figure in Western philosophy, but Sartre's anti-essentialism and his existentialism are not the, so to speak, existentialism of Mullah Sadra and the people in the Islamic world. They're quite different. And you know, whether there's a table in the next room or not, and whether we perceive it, this is not, I don't see a contradiction at all, because the existence of a thing is independent of whether it can be perceived or not.
Can you please elaborate on that? So, like, if it is not perceived, then how we can say anything about its existence?
We may realize it exists later. We may discover it later.
But that would be...
The planet Uranus existed for quite some time until I don't know exactly who saw it in his telescope, and then, lo and behold, there it is. But it certainly existed before the astronomer in question discovered it through perceiving it through an extension of his senses with a telescope. عدم الوجدان لا يدل على عدم الوجود. That the fact that you may not be able to perceive something does not establish that that thing does not exist. So perception is a means by which we discover existence of something, but it is not in any way a condition. Perception is in no way inextricably linked to the existence of a thing.
I know you just talked about how you don't need to perceive something to prove it. But because I have very basic understanding of Christianity, but Christianity, God is actually omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent. So if that God could perceive everything, if there was something that could perceive everything, would that be sufficient proof to prove that everything does exist?
Would that be sufficient proof to prove what?
To prove that things exist. If there is or is it? You said that it's not. You don't need to perceive something for it to exist. But
right.
If there's something that could perceive everything, does that mean that what does that mean, proving things exist or not? Because Christians believe that there is something that can do that. That everything...
It's not just Christians who believe that. There's plenty of theists who would share that, which would agree with you. Yeah, so...
But what does that say about the nature of existence? If that a being can it's possible to perceive all these things, what does that say? Because obviously, as humans, we cannot perceive everything, like you talked about. But if there was a being that could perceive everything, what does that say about the nature of existence?
All right. Well, for people like Mullah Sadra, Ibn Sina, also for people like Thomas Aquinas, if they replace metaphysical language with theological language, they're talking about God. If they put it back into metaphysical language, they're talking about being with a capital B or existence with a capital E. And in the case of God, in Arabic, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He doesn't have a quiddity in the sense that we were talking about. His quiddity is His existence, and His existence is His quiddity. And since He is complete pure being and sheer being, it can also be established once you have proved the existence of God. That's a whole other discussion. But typically, people like Mullah Sadra and Avicenna as well, although Mullah Sadra doesn't really engage in these proofs too much. He has his own way. After Ibn Sina came up with his proof, everyone sort of liked that one, based on contingency and necessity. Then you can also establish that this God, this pure being, is unique, is one, and then is utterly simple. Now, many modern Christians don't accept that, especially the evangelicals. This is the doctrine of divine simplicity, which the Catholics uphold and which the traditional Muslims do as well, which means that God is utterly simple, which means He isn't composite in any way. He is not a composite of potency and act. And obviously that presents huge problems because because Aquinas does that, but then Aquinas says yes, but then we believe in the Trinity. But there, reason shuts down. You accept it on the basis of the testimony of the Scriptures, the so-called New Testament. End of story. But a lot of the evangelicals say no. We can't accept the doctrine of divine simplicity. God is a person, and there are three persons of the Trinity. They are co-equal and they are co-eternal, as was decided in the Council of Nicaea in 325, etc., 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 etc. So I don't know if I've answered your question. You said, well, what does that establish about the divine being? I mean, it certainly establishes through a number of arguments and entailments that he or it, it is, excuse me, utterly simple. And then you can establish the other divine attributes as well, and that's how it's usually done in what in Western thought is called natural theology, and it has its similar disciplines in the Islamic world as well. Yes. You already asked a question, so if there's anybody else, if you don't mind, because you already had a chance. I saw your hand up first, sir.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Two questions. What John said earlier, is it effective to summarize what I'm thinking? I believe it was Leonardo da Vinci. I may be wrong. That said that, paraphrasing him, an idea is greater than anything that exists or has existed in the past, because all things must start with an idea or a concept before it exists. Meaning the relationship is proceeding and it's cognitive. It's the right and the left hand, but they are not to be confused, just like you were giving an example of the table. Is that effective in what you're saying? Am I misperceiving that in any way in my thoughts?
I agree with the general notion which you have just articulated.
Okay, excellent. Yeah. And then moving on, I got that right.
Okay.
Make sure I had that right.
So this is a preliminary leading into another. Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
You said you mentioned about an entity that is beyond conditioning. Am I right using the word entity, right? Entity. There's entities that are conditioned, and then that are malevolent or negative rather, and then there's conditioned beings that are not negative, and then there's entities beyond conditioning. What was the source of that again, and how can something be beyond conditioning if it's within? It would have to possess multiple dimensions, right?
Yes, here, sir, you have misunderstood what I was saying.
Right.
I was talking about pure being, not entities in the plural.
Okay, but being is existence.
Existence as such, with a capital E.
Okay.
And that existence as such can be utterly non-conditioned. And then we can speak of being as negatively conditioned, which here can... I had no intention of, and I'm sorry you misunderstood, of indicating a malefic or malevolent character to this. Negative simply means, and in the sense of negation here, being that if you want to use theological language, we can say what God is not. A kind of negative theology, a kind of apophasis. That's what I was referring to.
You were probably referring then to the Buddhism as far as existence.
That is one category in which you could maybe understand the Buddhist formulation of things. Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. So that's what was going on there. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
No problem. Yes, and back here.
I also wanted to comment on the comment of the gentleman on the question. I think when you're talking about perception, right, it's something you can perceive. If you don't perceive it, how do you know it exists and maybe it doesn't exist? Well, in South Asian philosophies, there is an idea of direct cognition and indirect cognition.
Yeah.
And some types of direct cognition is what we hear, what we see with our eyes, something with senses. And it depends on the philosophy. Jainism is different, and some Hindu philosophies is different. But the idea of indirect cognition is that, for instance, inference. Wherever there is smoke, there is fire. So if we see the smoke, we can infer that there is fire. And I wondered as how it works in some of the sources that you are dealing with, types of indirect cognition, such as inference or authority. Sometimes the scripture is indirect cognition, like the means of indirect cognition. And those are also very reliable sources. They're supposed to be reliable means of acquiring knowledge. I wonder how it works in your sources.
Yeah, so in the Islamic tradition, it may surprise some people, but there isn't anything called epistemology. Epistemology is a kind of later, a more modern sort of thing. And this was, these kind of questions were dealt with in traditional logic in the Islamic world. So in logic, is very much taken from Aristotle, but then the Muslims, again, they went with it. And so logic was really considered to be the study of the activity of the mind. And it was held that there were three fundamental acts of the mind. So simple apprehension or cognition, and then judgment, and then reasoning or argument. And so in simple apprehension, they would call that in Arabic a tasawwur. And then judgment is a tasdeeq. It's really the logic of propositions. And then argument, they study the syllogism and so forth. So in its Aristotelian form, except they have four figures, not three. There's, the fourth figure is implicit in Aristotle anyhow. So in the portion known as the tasawwur, they spend a lot of time examining what it means to perceive a thing, and also how that's expressed in words. So they study very closely the nature of language, especially in Arabic, and all sorts of, every sort of dimension you can imagine with Arabic, general and specific, what do they call them in English? Figurative and literal usage, metaphor, all of this kind of, there's a certain literary dimension as well. And that was also very deeply discussed, all of this, in the philosophy of Islamic law, because there you're analyzing the Quran, scripture, and statements of important people, the Prophet, and especially in Shiism, the Imams. And so, what does it mean for them to say what they seem to be saying? So all of that was discussed there. And then in terms of the kind of real deep insight into the nature of things, that is a different sort of language. They might have used the language of logic as well, but there are other terms as well. So they speak about kashf, which is unveiling, the lifting of the veil. They speak about mushahada. Mushahada is direct witnessing of the nature of things. It's like darshan, or it's also like, it is really ved. It's knowledge, but ved in the sense that it's something you see. And that's why, it's like, I use the term, the Hindu scripture is called the Ved, right? But it's that word means knowledge. Vidya in Sanskrit would be knowledge. And that word vidya is cognate to where we get the Latin, from Latin we get the English word video. It means to see. So it's the same kind of idea in Islam, is this direct visioning. Yeah.
The term you're looking for, direct perception, direct witnessing, I think it's pratyasha. More than...
Yes, thank you. Yeah. So suffice it to say that there are plenty of analogs in the Islamic tradition to what you would find in Indic traditions of spirituality. Yeah. There was, yes, in the back.
So if you understand Islamic philosophy in three levels, as thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, the early Aristotelian, then the Ishraqi, and then at last Sadrai, what are the underlying conditions that gave rise to the antithesis and the synthesis? Like, was it can we say that it was a decline of the Mu'tazili thinking and going back to Mesopotamian, Vedaic, Zoroastrian, going back to those sources with the Ishraqis, and then the rise of the Shiite thinking that brought the antithesis and the synthesis?
I know you're asking a really complicated historical question. I don't really feel competent to answer that. I don't know if I could even venture an answer into what were the historical reasons that thinking emerged when it did. It's very hard for me to say, and there may be others more qualified who could shed light on that, but I'm not one of them. I'm sorry. Yes.
So as you mentioned, throughout the whole lecture, like, we know that the table is brown because we can see it with our eyes. We know that the radio waves are there because of, as you phrased it, a device that is an extension of the senses. We base our reality and our perception of what exists entirely on the human senses. Do you think there's any reason to believe that the human senses may not be 100% accurate to like the definitive reality? And if so, do you think we should try and find out that definitive reality to better understand what existence is, or if that's even possible?
Well, I mean, for most mundane things, the five senses are pretty good. So I'm not sure what you're exactly asking about.
I guess it was brought up in this class earlier that the reason we see this pen as black is because our eyes tell us it's black.
Well, I have no reason to doubt that one, so.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, there's no reason to doubt it because I guess that's how the brain perceives it. But assuming that our senses are wrong or simply designed to allow us to get through day-to-day life while staying alive, there's room to assume that the definitive reality might differ somewhat from how we perceive it. And it might not be 100% accurate. And do you believe that that is possible? And if so, how does that affect our perception of existence?
Yeah, the ultimate truth or the ultimate reality of things is beyond mere conceptual elaborations or sense perceptions, and Mullah Sadra would agree with that. And indeed, but having said that, he would also say that everybody has when we're talking about existence, the ultimate existence, he would say that everybody has a fundamental, primal, basic intuition of what existence is. We know what it means, there's very few people who would ask you what is the meaning of is, right? To put it in terms of language. So everyone has this basic, shall we say, a minimal metaphysical intuition. And on the basis of that, everyone has a notion of what existence is. Notion on the level of the mind. But its ultimate reality, Mullah Sadra would say, lies in the extremity of hiddenness, and again can only be arrived at through an unveiling, he says. And his position of asalatul wujud, or the fundamental reality of existence, as also happened with Ibn al-Arabi, was not the result of mere book learning or didactic approaches and mere conceptual elaborations, but was the fruit or the result of a very severe and profound regimen of ascesis, of asceticism, which he practiced. He was in seclusion. He was involved in, what you might call meditation, fasting, and focusing really on the ultimate truth. And he writes about it. We know this for sure because he says it in more than one place in his many writings, that it was a situation of a kind of unveiling, that God unveiled the truth of this matter to him. And then it was afterwards that he understood that it could also be demonstrated rigorously through apodictic proof or through demonstration of the gold standard of demonstration in Aristotelian logic. And then he said that also, in other words, his unveiling and what was established by demonstration was exactly what the Quran also had to say. So he talked about these three dimensions of Quran, and they all rhyme in Arabic. Quran, which is the Quran, right? And then Burhan, which is proof, demonstration. And then Irfan, which means gnosis. So.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, go ahead.
This idea of God or Allah being an exemplification of being as a whole, and the whole universe is God. How does that relate, and what is perhaps the reciprocal nature of that with the Buddhist idea of being one substance, and an object takes up a portion of that substance for one time, and then it wears away and becomes something else? So what is the nature between?
No, he did not have the idea that the universe was God.
Did he not? Did I misunderstand that?
I think you did, yes. I never said that.
What's his idea that was somewhat related to that? Talking to something
So this is where it gets very interesting. This is often what happens, and this happened in the Islamic tradition as well. So people like Mullah Sadra, people like Muhyiddin ibn Arabi were often condemned by other Muslims, specifically because they were accused of saying that everything is God. And that's not really the claim that they are making. They're saying that if you really arrive at this mystical realization, then you will understand that there aren't individual entities. There's only Allah. You don't see the individual entities. But that's maybe it's a very fine nuance to say, to make that distinction. That he's not really saying that the whole universe is God. So that's the first thing. And then I'm not sure I understood what you said about Buddhism. And again, I'm not an expert on Buddhism. So would you like to repeat that part, and we can maybe try or?
Yeah, in Jewish thought, the universe is like one. I'm not sure substance is the right word for it, but
yeah.
lack of Buddhist language, I guess that's what I'll have to use. Is that like everything is made of the same thing, and different objects or states or anything that exists is an exemplification or an explication of that field in the aspect of what an object is. So just as a table could be composed of, the iron in the wood, or in the legs, the carbon in the wood, it all exists in the same, it all is the same substance, but it takes different forms in certain points in time. So it all is the same substance, it just has different qualia at different points.
I'm sorry, I don't.
Can I comment on that? Yes, I think that you're talking about, for instance, if you take wood. Wood is the substance, but out of wood we can make a chair, we can make a table, we can build a house. So it's the substance remains the same, but the qualities and the shapes, those can change and evolve. It's the same with metal or with gold, right? Like with earrings or pendant, it's different kind of jewelry, but it's the same substance. I think that's what you're referring to, right?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so with that clarification, then what's the question?
It just, to me, what Mullah Sadra and what Buddhists believe seems very similar and very linked, that everything is the same thing, just used different ways at different points in time.
Perhaps, because he's talking about being, so yeah, so it's very, very possible.
You were saying earlier, oneness and commentary. What is your opinion in the placement of the Hermetica in that with the cross-cultural exchanges within the ancient world? Do you have an opinion on the theme of the Hermetica as far as oneness? Are you familiar with the text? Because
you're referring to the Corpus Hermeticum,
yes.
Right?
Yes, please.
So the Corpus Hermeticum, I do not think that work ever made it into Arabic. All right. However, the figure of Hermes Thoth is identified in the Islamic tradition with Idris, who is a prophet mentioned in the Quran, who corresponds to the, if I'm not mistaken, the biblical Enoch. And so there was an idea that there was a kind of revelatory knowledge which was given to this antediluvian pre-flood figure known as Hermes. And the occult knowledge that he specifically was supposed to have had was the knowledge of astrology, alchemy, and things of this nature. And those are part of the occult sciences, and all of those were very big in the Islamic world. And in texts of that kind, the name of Hermes does come up from time to time, as does the name of others. There's actually a book on the Arabic Hermes tradition in English. I think that's the title, The Arabic Hermes. If you search on Amazon, you might find it. Yeah.
What I read in my studies was that it influenced early Islamic thinkers who were later executed, and some of them were Sufis, early Sufis. And I was just wondering where the cultural exchange, where would you cut the fine line as far as the concept of oneness, the chicken come before the egg?
Well, the concept of oneness is, that's Islam. If we talk about the divine unity,
They could have been complementary, considering this.
they were complementary, and especially with Plotinus. Not as much as Hermes, but Plotinus, and particularly the Aeneads of Plotinus, the last half of which were translated into Arabic and were very widely read and continue to be read, believe it or not, in that Arabic version to this day.
So that explains the skepticism on the matter. Thank you.
To some extent, yes. Thank you.
Well, we're out of time, unfortunately, but join me in thanking Dr. Sayed.
Thank you.